The moment Gwen Hollister's mouth twisted into that triumphant smirk and said those 7 words, I knew my entire world had just shifted. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. Standing there in her corner office on the 42nd floor, watching her cancel 18 months of my life's work with 3 swift keystrokes, I felt something break inside me that I hadn't felt since I was 17 years old. The same hollow ache that came the morning I found my father slumped over his kitchen table, surrounded by rejection letters and foreclosure notices, his heart having given out from the stress of losing everything to corporate predators exactly like her. She didn't even look up from her monitor as she terminated contract after contract. Akiko Tanaka from Osaka, the Petrova family in Bulgaria, Miguel Santos in Mexico City. People who had trusted me, who had built their businesses around our partnerships, who were probably right now preparing shipments they'd never be paid for. Honestly, I don't understand why Harrison hired you in the first place. Gwen continued, her fingers dancing across the keyboard like she was playing piano. All this relationship-building nonsense. We're a business, not a charity for immigrant sob stories. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching across the world. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification because what I'm about to share with you changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought powerful people could destroy lives without consequences. My name is Claire, and I need you to understand something about Gwen Hollister before we continue. She wasn't just any executive. She was the kind of person who had built her entire career on a foundation of other people's broken dreams. 23 years at Morrison Industrial, climbing from junior analyst to vice president of global procurement, leaving a trail of destroyed careers behind her like breadcrumbs. But here's what she didn't know about me, what nobody at Morrison knew about me. 15 years ago, when I was a freshman at State, my father worked for a small consulting firm that Gwen's previous company acquired. Dad was 58, had been with his firm for 16 years, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had built relationships across Europe that brought in 60% of their international revenue. Gwen systematically destroyed him over 6 months, not with one dramatic confrontation, but with the slow poison of professional humiliation. She questioned his reports in meetings, reassigned his clients to younger staff, started rumors about his mental capacity, made him rewrite proposals 5, 6, 7 times for reasons that changed daily. She turned his own team against him by suggesting he was holding back the company's growth. My father, who had survived immigrating to this country with nothing, who had built a reputation based on honor and reliability, who had never missed a day of work in his entire career, started having panic attacks in the office parking lot. He'd sit in his car for 20 minutes every morning, trying to gather the strength to walk inside and face another day of psychological warfare. The morning I found him at that kitchen table, surrounded by termination papers and medical bills he couldn't afford, was the morning I promised myself that someday, somehow, I would understand people like Gwen Hollister. I would learn how they operated, how they thought, how they justified destroying human beings for profit margins and personal advancement. I studied business, specialized in international supply chain management, and spent 7 years working for smaller firms, learning every aspect of global procurement. Not because I loved the work, but because I was building myself into exactly the kind of person who could get close to someone like Gwen. When the position at Morrison opened up, when I saw Gwen's name listed as the hiring manager, I knew the universe was giving me an opportunity I couldn't waste. But I also knew that simple revenge wouldn't be enough. It had to be poetic. It had to teach her something about consequences. It had to make her feel the same helplessness my father felt in those final months. So I took the job, and I became exactly what Gwen needed me to be: enthusiastic, hardworking, grateful for the opportunity. Someone who asked just enough questions to seem engaged, but never enough to seem threatening. Someone who could travel extensively without complaints, who could work with difficult international partners, who could solve problems that more senior staff couldn't handle. For 18 months, I built relationships that Morrison had never dreamed possible, not just with suppliers, but with their families, their communities, their stories. I learned that Akiko Tanaka's grandfather had been forced to sell his textile business after the war, and she was trying to rebuild what her family had lost. I discovered that the Petrova family had started their packaging company after fleeing political persecution, using their grandmother's life savings as collateral. Miguel Santos had 3 daughters, all studying engineering, all hoping to expand the family's precision tooling business into aerospace components. Every single relationship I cultivated was with people who reminded me of my father, people who had worked their entire lives to build something meaningful, something that could survive beyond themselves. But I wasn't building these relationships for Morrison's benefit. I was building them for something much larger. You see, while I was traveling and negotiating and solving supply chain problems, I was also researching Gwen's career history. Every company she'd worked for, every acquisition she'd managed, every restructuring she'd overseen, and what I found was a pattern that made my stomach hurt with recognition. 15 years ago, it wasn't just my father. There was Linda Chen, a translator who had helped Gwen's team navigate contracts in Taiwan. Gwen fired her 3 days before Christmas, claiming budget cuts, then hired her replacement at twice the salary. Linda's family lost their house. There was Roberto Vega, who had managed relationships with Mexican manufacturers for 8 years. Gwen eliminated his position, took credit for his work, then used his contacts to negotiate deals that saved the company millions. Roberto ended up driving for a delivery service, trying to support his wife's cancer treatments without health insurance. There was Elena Kowalski, whose small Polish firm had provided specialty components for automotive clients. Gwen convinced the parent company to demand impossible contract terms, forcing Elena into bankruptcy, then swooped in to acquire her equipment and client list for pennies. The pattern was always the same. Identify vulnerable people doing essential work, systematically undermine them, take everything they'd built, move on without looking back. Gwen had built her entire career on the corpses of small business owners and immigrant workers who trusted the wrong person. So when I started reaching out to suppliers for Morrison, I wasn't just looking for the best deals or the most reliable partners. I was specifically seeking out people whose stories echoed the ones I'd found in Gwen's wake. People who had been broken by corporate predators, who had rebuilt from nothing, who understood what it meant to have your life's work destroyed by someone who saw you as disposable. And I found them everywhere. Akiko's textile company. Her father had been cheated by an American distributor in the 90s, losing contracts that nearly bankrupted the family. The Petrova packaging firm? They'd been forced out of partnerships with Western companies who promised stability then disappeared with their designs. Miguel's tooling business? His brother had been systematically excluded from contracts by procurement managers who preferred working with larger, whiter-owned firms. Every supplier I brought to Morrison carried scars from people exactly like Gwen. And slowly, carefully, I started telling them stories. Not about my father specifically, but about the patterns I'd observed, the way certain executives operated, the warning signs to watch for, the importance of protecting yourself when dealing with corporate predators. I never said Gwen's name. I never made specific accusations. I just shared observations about how powerful people sometimes treated partners they considered expendable, and how important it was to maintain leverage in relationships with companies that might not honor their commitments. By month 12, every supplier contract I'd negotiated included specific clauses about notification periods, penalty structures, and coordinated withdrawal rights. Terms that seemed reasonable from Morrison's perspective but would prove devastating if triggered simultaneously. I presented these clauses as standard international protections, necessary for working with overseas partners who had been burned before. Gwen signed every contract without reading the fine print, trusting my expertise and focused only on the cost savings I was delivering. Morrison's profit margins improved by 38% in my first year, largely because I'd found suppliers willing to work for rates that barely covered their costs. Hoping to build long-term relationships with an American company that seemed to value their contributions. By month 15, I had documentation of everything, not just the contracts and financial arrangements, but the personal stories behind each partnership. Video testimonials from supplier families about their hopes for the future, photos of their facilities, their workers, their communities. evidence of how Morrison's business was literally supporting hundreds of families across 3 continents. I also had detailed reports on Gwen's decision-making patterns, her attitudes toward international partners, her casual dismissal of suppliers she considered beneath her notice, comments she'd made about these people and their backwards business practices, email chains where she mocked the English skills of partners who spoke 4 languages fluently. By month 18, the web was complete. Every critical component in Morrison's supply chain flowed through relationships I'd built with people who had been destroyed by executives like Gwen. People who trusted me, who understood that I saw them as human beings rather than profit centers, who knew I would never treat them the way corporate America had treated them before. And then came that Tuesday morning when Gwen decided she'd had enough of my relationship-building nonsense. I'd been in her office for what I thought was a routine quarterly review. Morrison had just announced record profits, driven largely by the international partnerships I'd developed. I expected recognition, maybe discussion of a promotion. Instead, Gwen pulled up her computer and started explaining how the company was shifting toward domestic suppliers exclusively. "These foreign contracts are too complicated," she said, scrolling through the list of partnerships I'd spent months cultivating. "Too much hand-holding, too many cultural sensitivities to manage. We need suppliers who understand American business practices." I watched her cancel Akiko's textile contract, worth $2 million annually. Gone. The Petrova packaging deal, 18 months of negotiations, terminated. Miguel's precision components, essential for Morrison's aerospace division, eliminated. "But Gwen," I said carefully, "these suppliers provide components we can't source domestically. The Petrova family produces packaging materials with specifications that American manufacturers can't match. Miguel's tooling precision is beyond anything available in our price range here." She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language myself. "Claire, you're thinking like a relationship counselor instead of a business professional. We don't need their sob stories about family businesses and cultural traditions. We need products delivered on schedule at competitive prices. There are plenty of American suppliers who can provide what we need without all the emotional complexity." That phrase, emotional complexity, hit me like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of language Gwen had used 15 years ago when describing my father's inefficient approach to client relationships. The same dismissive tone she'd employed while systematically destroying everyone who had ever trusted her professional judgment. I realized in that moment that Gwen hadn't learned anything from her decades of destroying lives. She hadn't developed empathy or wisdom or even basic human decency. She was exactly the same person who had driven my father to his grave, just with better suits and a bigger office. "What about the penalty clauses?" I asked quietly. "The coordinated withdrawal provisions in these contracts." Gwen waved her hand dismissively. "Legal will handle whatever paperwork needs to be filed. These people should be grateful they got 18 months of business from us. Most international suppliers never get opportunities like this." She finished canceling the last contract and turned to face me with that triumphant smirk. "Honestly, Claire, I think this will be good for your professional development. You've gotten too emotionally invested in these partnerships. In this business, you can't afford to care about every supplier's personal story. Success requires focusing on results, not relationships." And that's when she said it. The 7 words that changed everything. "We don't need your foreign connections anymore." I nodded slowly, thanked her for the feedback, and walked out of her office. But instead of going back to my desk, I walked directly to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and started making phone calls. The first call was to Akiko Tanaka in Osaka. It was 3 a.m. her time, but she answered on the second ring, probably thinking it was an emergency, which, in a way, it was. "Akiko, this is Claire from Morrison. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to make some phone calls of your own." Within 6 hours, every single supplier I'd partnered with over 18 months had received identical messages, not from me directly, but from each other. The network I'd spent so long building wasn't just about business relationships. It was about shared experiences, mutual protection, and understanding exactly when to act together. Akiko called the Petrova family in Bulgaria. The Petrovas reached out to Miguel in Mexico City. Miguel contacted the semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan. The Taiwanese suppliers called the packaging companies in Vietnam. Like dominoes falling in reverse, each conversation triggered three more, until suppliers across 12 countries were simultaneously reviewing their Morrison contracts and discovering something interesting. Every single one of their agreements contained the same coordinated withdrawal clause I'd carefully negotiated months earlier. Language that seemed like standard legal protection but actually meant that if Morrison terminated any international supplier without cause, all remaining international suppliers had the right to withdraw immediately without penalty. By Thursday morning, Morrison's production floor was silent. Not because of a strike or equipment failure, but because 68% of their critical components simply stopped arriving. The precision tooling from Miguel's shop that kept their aerospace division running, the specialty polymers from Vietnam that made their automotive parts possible, the textile components from Akiko that were essential for their defense contracts. I watched from my desk as operations managers started panicking around 10 a.m., making frantic phone calls to suppliers who politely explained they were exercising their contractual withdrawal rights. By noon, the manufacturing supervisors were gathered in emergency meetings, trying to understand how Morrison had become so dependent on international suppliers they apparently no longer needed. Gwen spent Thursday afternoon in crisis management mode, calling domestic suppliers who quoted prices 3 times higher than our international partners, with delivery timelines stretching into next quarter. Companies that could maybe provide substitutes for some components, but had never even heard of others. This is a temporary adjustment period, she announced to the operations team Friday morning, her voice carrying just a hint of strain. We're transitioning to more reliable domestic partnerships that align with our strategic vision. But by Friday afternoon, Morrison's biggest client, a defense contractor expecting delivery of specialized components next week, called to express concerns about production delays. Then the automotive company that relied on Morrison's precision parts started asking questions about alternative suppliers. I spent that entire week documenting everything, not just the operational chaos, but Gwen's responses to it. Her dismissive comments about suppliers who were overreacting to normal business decisions. Her insistence that international partners were inherently unreliable and that Morrison was better off without them. Her complete inability to understand why terminating 68% of their supply chain simultaneously might cause problems. But the real revelation came Monday morning, when CEO Harrison called an emergency executive meeting. I wasn't supposed to be in that room, but Harrison had specifically requested that I attend, since I was the only person who fully understood Morrison's international supplier relationships. Gwen looked genuinely confused about why I was there, probably assuming I'd be blamed for the crisis rather than consulted about solutions. Harrison started the meeting with a simple question. Can someone explain to me how we went from record profits to production shutdown in 4 days? Gwen launched into a polished presentation about supply chain diversification, strategic realignment, and the benefits of domestic sourcing. She had slides prepared showing cost projections and risk assessments, all demonstrating why eliminating international suppliers was sound business strategy. The temporary disruption we're experiencing, she concluded confidently, is the natural consequence of transitioning away from an over-reliance on foreign partnerships that were ultimately unsustainable. Harrison listened patiently, then turned to me. Claire, you built these relationships. Help me understand what actually happened here. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, without fully realizing it, for 18 months. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd been building since Tuesday, the one that told the real story of Morrison's international partnerships. Mr. Harrison, with your permission, I'd like to show you exactly who our international suppliers are and what our relationships with them actually meant. The first slide showed Akiko Tanaka's textile facility in Osaka. Not just production statistics, but photos of her family's workshop, her grandfather's original equipment, the 3 generations of workers who had helped build components for Morrison's defense contracts. I explained how Akiko had restructured her entire operation around Morrison's specifications, hiring 12 additional workers and investing in new machinery specifically for our partnership. The second slide introduced the Petrova family. Elena Petrova's husband had lost his engineering job during Bulgaria's economic crisis, and their packaging company had been their family's path back to stability. Morrison's contracts had allowed them to expand into a new facility, providing employment for 43 people in their rural community. The third slide showed Miguel Santos and his precision tooling operation. I displayed photos of his 3 daughters, all studying engineering, all hoping to join the family business that Morrison's aerospace contracts had made possible. Miguel had been working 16-hour days to meet Morrison's quality standards, building equipment that literally couldn't be sourced anywhere else at our price point. Slide after slide, I introduced Harrison to people Gwen had dismissed as foreign connections. I showed him facility tours, quality certifications, testimonials from workers whose families depended on Morrison's business. I demonstrated how these weren't just vendor relationships, but partnerships with specific human beings who had bet their futures on Morrison's commitment. These suppliers weren't just providing components, I explained, watching Harrison's expression change as he absorbed the scope of what we'd lost. They were providing components that can't be replicated domestically. Akiko's textile process uses techniques her grandfather developed. The Petrova's packaging materials have chemical properties that American manufacturers can't match. Miguel's tooling precision exists because he's been refining his processes for 20 years. Then I showed Harrison the financial impact. Not just the immediate production delays, but the long-term consequences of losing supplier relationships that had taken decades to develop. The contracts we'd voided represented partnerships worth $47 million annually, with suppliers who had been averaging 18% year-over-year growth in their work with Morrison. Mr. Harrison, I continued, these partnerships weren't expendable overhead. They were competitive advantages that our domestic competitors don't have access to. We were paying lower prices for higher quality because these suppliers trusted Morrison enough to prioritize our contracts over potentially more profitable opportunities. I watched Gwen's face throughout my presentation, seeing her confusion gradually shift to concern as Harrison asked increasingly pointed questions about the termination decisions. Why hadn't she consulted with operations before canceling critical supplier relationships? Why hadn't she explored transition timelines instead of immediate terminations? Why hadn't she understood the coordinated withdrawal clauses before triggering them? But the moment that really changed everything came when I showed Harrison the final section of my presentation, the documentation I'd gathered about each supplier's previous experiences with American companies. The pattern of international partners being promised long-term relationships, delivering exceptional results, then being abandoned when companies decided to streamline their operations. These suppliers worked with Morrison despite having been burned before. I explained, because they believed we were different, because I spent 18 months proving that we valued their contributions and understood their worth. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the financial projections and supplier profiles. Finally, he looked at Gwen with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger, but deep disappointment. Gwen, help me understand the strategic thinking behind eliminating $47 million in annual revenue without consulting operations, finance, or the executive team. Gwen started explaining again about domestic sourcing and simplified logistics, but her confidence was wavering. She kept using phrases like "these people" and "cultural complications," language that sounded increasingly problematic in the context of my presentation. What cultural complications? Harrison asked. Claire's documentation suggests these suppliers were consistently exceeding quality standards and delivery requirements. Well, the language barriers, the time zone difficulties, the constant need for relationship management, Gwen replied, her voice getting tighter. International suppliers require so much hand-holding compared to domestic partners who understand American business practices. That's when Harrison asked the question that revealed everything. Gwen, have you reviewed the withdrawal clauses in these contracts? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Because, according to Claire's documentation, every international supplier had the contractual right to withdraw immediately if Morrison terminated other international suppliers without cause. Did you understand that canceling one contract would trigger coordinated withdrawal from all international partners? More silence. Gwen's face was losing color as she realized Harrison wasn't asking rhetorical questions. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "I trusted that legal had reviewed these contracts appropriately. The withdrawal clauses seemed like standard protective language." "Standard protective language," Harrison repeated slowly. "Gwen, these clauses exist specifically to prevent companies from treating international suppliers as expendable. They're designed to ensure that partnerships are honored rather than eliminated on executive whims." I watched Gwen realize that she'd walked into a trap of her own making. Not because I'd tricked her, but because her fundamental contempt for international partners had blinded her to the actual terms of relationships I'd spent months negotiating. "Claire," Harrison said, turning back to me, "in your assessment, is there any possibility of rebuilding these partnerships?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when I could deliver the truth that would change everything for Gwen, without revealing my personal motivations. "Mr. Harrison, I spent Friday reaching out to our former suppliers to explore reconciliation possibilities. Unfortunately, the response has been consistent across all partners. They're willing to consider future relationships with Morrison, but only under one specific condition." "What condition?" "They require written guarantee that Gwen Hollister will have no involvement in international supplier relationships going forward." The room went dead silent. Gwen stared at me like I'd slapped her. "They what?" she whispered. "I'm sorry, Gwen, but I have to be completely honest about their feedback. Multiple suppliers specifically mentioned feeling disrespected during previous interactions with you. They cited comments about their English skills, dismissive attitudes toward their business practices, and what they perceived as cultural insensitivity." I pulled up my laptop again, showing Harrison documented communications from our former partners. Not recordings or private conversations, but formal written responses to my reconciliation inquiries. Akiko Tanaka's letter was particularly damaging. Ms. Hollister's approach to international partnerships demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of mutual respect in business relationships. Her comments about foreign complications and simplified logistics suggest Morrison views international suppliers as problematic rather than valuable. Miguel Santos had been even more direct. "We appreciate Claire's professionalism, but cannot risk future investments with company leadership that considers our contributions dispensable. Ms. Hollister's termination approach indicates systematic disregard for international partner commitments." One by one, I shared feedback from suppliers across 3 continents, all expressing similar concerns about Gwen's attitudes and decision-making. Not angry rants or emotional complaints, but professional assessments of why they couldn't trust Morrison's leadership going forward. "These aren't personal attacks," I explained to Harrison. "They're business decisions based on demonstrated patterns of behavior. International suppliers can't afford to invest in partnerships with companies that might eliminate them arbitrarily." Harrison spent the next hour reviewing supplier, documentation, contract terms, and financial projections. He asked detailed questions about rebuilding possibilities, domestic sourcing alternatives, and operational timelines. Throughout the entire discussion, Gwen sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as the scope of her miscalculation became clear. Finally, Harrison closed his laptop and looked directly at Gwen. "I need some time to review this situation with the board. Claire, can you provide me with comprehensive documentation of our international supplier relationships and the specific feedback you've received about rebuilding possibilities?" "Of course, Mr. Harrison." "Gwen, I'll need you to prepare a detailed report explaining the strategic reasoning behind these termination decisions and your assessment of domestic sourcing alternatives." After the meeting ended, Gwen cornered me by the elevator, her professional composure finally cracking. "Claire, what exactly did you tell these suppliers about me?" I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained throughout the presentation. "I told them the truth, Gwen. I shared your exact words about not needing foreign connections anymore." "That's not. I didn't mean," she started, then stopped herself. "You didn't mean what? That you don't value international partnerships? That cultural sensitivity is unnecessary? That relationship management is emotional complexity we can't afford?" She stared at me, probably realizing for the first time that her casual dismissal of international suppliers had been documented and shared with the very people she'd dismissed. Those suppliers trusted Morrison because they trusted me, I continued. When you terminated their contracts while calling their work foreign complications, you destroyed relationships that took 18 months to build. They're not angry, Gwen. They're protecting themselves from exactly the kind of treatment you've given them. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, I said the words I'd been waiting 15 years to deliver. Sometimes the people you consider dispensable turn out to be the ones holding everything together. 3 weeks later, Harrison announced that Morrison was restructuring its procurement division. Gwen Hollister would be transitioning to a customer service role, where her domestic focus would be better utilized. I was promoted to Director of Global Supplier Relations, with full authority to rebuild the international partnerships Morrison had lost. It took 6 months to restore relationships with most of our former suppliers, not because they were vindictive, but because they needed proof that Morrison had learned from its mistakes. They wanted guarantees, oversight structures, and cultural sensitivity training for all executive staff involved in international partnerships. Gwen lasted 8 months in customer service before transferring to a smaller company. According to people who stayed in touch, she now handles complaint calls for a regional distribution center, dealing daily with frustrated customers who feel ignored and dismissed by corporate policies they can't control. I never told anyone about my father, never mentioned the real reason I'd chosen Morrison, or why I'd spent 18 months building relationships with suppliers who reminded me of people Gwen had destroyed before. The revenge wasn't about exposing her past, it was about letting her experience the consequences of her own choices. Every supplier who withdrew from Morrison did so because Gwen had treated them as expendable. Every partnership we lost was lost because she valued control more than collaboration. Every financial consequence Morrison faced was the direct result of her decisions, her words, her fundamental inability to see international partners as human beings worthy of respect. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Gwen lose her executive position or seeing her struggle in customer service. It was knowing that she finally understood what my father had felt during those last 6 months of his life. The helplessness of watching everything you've built disappear because someone more powerful decided you were no longer valuable. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you understand why I spent 18 months planning something this complex, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Because there are more Gwen Hollisters out there, more executives who think human beings are expendable, and more stories about what happens when people underestimate the power of patience, planning, and the relationships we build with each other. The people who seem invisible to those in power, we see everything, and sometimes we remember longer than they think we do.